Hello everyone, today we talk about the evolution of common law in Germany and the Netherlands during the 17th century. Some months ago I made a video about the Rezeption, that is the reception in fact of Roman law in Germany. And so we have illustrated how and why the mechanism proceeded, and how substantially what had been, say, the Romanistic juridical address prevalent from, say, the studies of the Bolognese school, overflowing essentially in the rest of Western Europe, had been required in a measure to homogenize, in fact, in a statal unitary direction, and not just because of imperial will, but in fact all those German states that were trying to affirm a more stable, sort of homogeneous, also internationally recognized point of reference juridically. As you can expect with the Reformation, but not only, there had been significant, had been a significant instrumentalization of this dispute, because just the fact that Roman law sounded pretty much like, the same direction where the papacy was coming from, etc. There was, given the important heterogeneity in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire in terms of essentially mostly the feudal. The intricate feudal forest that had somehow remained, with over 300 states in Germany, and some, say, from one side concentration power attempts, but from the other also some centrifugal ones. The issue of recovering a properly Germanic common law, customary law basis, not to simply oppose, but essentially to integrate and safeguard, to integrate in and safeguard from, to some degree as well, the Roman law began to develop. All right. And I should stress that, of course, when we talk about common law, we're talking about pretty much what traditionally the entire juridical system of Europe had been. Right. The Romans having been the first ones to establish a real state in the western part of Europe, and having sort of also during the Middle Ages poured out from Rome, from in fact the universities of northern Italy, this great systematic, not just recovery of the Roman law that was essentially the Theodosian Code regenerated in Justinian times, also, as you know, a massive and incredibly rich and incredibly as practically oriented juridical theory from the commentarists, right, had, as we just said, had provided with the most sound example of what essentially law had to evolve, in which direction, etc. In every country in Europe, we've seen it, in fact, with the Rezeption, we've seen it with the Mos Gallicus, with the Mos Italicus, the latter also quite directly imitated by the Spanish, especially during the 16th century and beyond, because of the Spanish dominion in Italy after the Italian wars, etc. Had all, again, their address, right? The countries of common law in Europe had remained historically, let's say, England, because it had, as you know, undergone a quite, let's say, deep, intense, right, political and institutional dichotomy with its monarchy, and thus had managed to make the idea of a natural law of the English people, in that case, preceding the monarchic institution, and so the derivation from that. Germany in part had the same thing, but in a less organic way, because fundamentally the country had exploded differently from England. It was a national monarchy, and as such the thing would be much more shaded. Again, also, if you look at France, Italy, etc., these countries had historically just all had common law, as a general part of the customary law, by the way, because what's common law originally, right? It's a set of laws that has come customarily to be accepted in a given land by a given community, and that indeed, also from a historical point of view, to some degree, had preceded the establishment of a kingdom, right, of a specific legal system that would be engineered later on the basis of the same common law by an authority that was called, if anything, to fill the gaps of the former, like if the common law had not disciplined clearly one aspect, like of jurisprudence, the king was called to intervene. Of course, this law had to be approved by the parliament, by the estates of the realm. There were countries where, for example, the monarchic intervention in terms of legislation in the country's affairs were very, very strong from an early era, such as France, right? Others, England is the paradigm here, the dichotomic opposite, right? The monarchic capacity to enforce this had been essentially already and severely limited from the 13th century. So during the Renaissance, the state concentrates power for many necessary reasons. And so when we look at these various addresses of juridical school, we are essentially witnessing a bit like the mirror of the same political and institutional situation, right? So the 17th century is quite fascinating also because of and especially for Germany and the Netherlands as well, the latter is factually seceding from the former. That's an aspect often, say, not fully rationalized, right? We think it more like of Switzerland, instead of had a much softer goodbye, whereas the United Provinces had a quite interesting history on their own. But there is, in fact, the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War. After the Treaty of Westphalia, there is a big deal, of course, of state rebuilding, or better definition on the basis also of individual, for example, confessional adherence, right? And, the cuius regio, eius religion, all the issues for which great part of the wars fought in Germany, since in fact, the Maximilian, Charles V had been fought over. And we have witnessed in the video about the Rezeption and about the spread of Roman law in Germany, how the Romanization of the autochthonous Germanic law had met already, in fact, since the 16th century. That is the moment in which, in fact, this Roman law is pretty much accepted everywhere in Western Europe as a point of reference, if anything, even by those countries those communities that are more, let's say, part autonomous or have some stronger local tradition, like for better or for worse, like in terms of, for example, again, statal, the degree of statal development, etc. England, Germany being, can say, linked to some degree in this. And of course, there had been these resistances, and quite intense ones to a degree, because there was just like a general juridical current that would defend the customary tradition of the German regions, of the German lands, plural. This is important, of course, also from a political point of view. And the instances of this so-called, can call it Germanistic current, had solicited the same jurists that were favorable to the reception of Roman law to highlight the peculiarity of the local, the German customary law. Why? Because you could not allocate the various Germanic institutions otherwise within the Romanistic categories. This is quite relevant because this is what we've seen already in the other videos about, of course, the medieval law and how the Roman one had been recovered, revived, etc. That the precipitous reason for which Roman law had been recovered was not a direct application of the same. This would essentially occur given that eventually medieval society became as complex as the Roman one, and the latter law, also in terms of the establishment of a strong civil public authority, was very necessary in many ways, aside from the interests of the rulers. But that this was going in parallel with, again, the Renaissance, with the establishment of modern state and so on. This is nothing to be surprised of. And the way the customary laws that were seen as a sort of an inalienable right of itself from the local communities of the same were not to be cancelled, but correctly framed within the Roman institutions, and as such being addressed more functionally and directly and uniformly, and in a way that could be also much more readily enacted themselves. So once you recognize the specific reason of an aspect of customary law, you would essentially reconnect it to some Romanistic concepts that, of course, were, in a universal sense, of course, dealing with these various phenomena, because Roman law itself had been born out of, Roman of common law. I mean, what we see is technically the Roman common law eventually homogenized in a sort of more subtle direction, as still in the early empire, the Romans had factually a common law of their own, but naturally is expanding towards a much more, complete, system, and a theoretical one, a less. What you want is the certainty of justice in many ways, and so, think in Germany, say, if even the issues of a country run with this multitude of states that, of course, all intertwined with one another, that there isn't like a neatly distinguished, like, territorial dimension separating this state from the other, is all an incredibly intricate feudal, customary, and in part also Roman issue that must be sorted out in the best way possible. Now, in the 17th century, the Germanistic current found itself more effective expressions. Right, during the 16th century, we can't say really just that the Germanistic jurisprudence had come up with anything that could match Romanistics. In the 17th century, there is a much deeper reflection, also because of the broader political situation, the ultimate defeat, at least compared on the original intention of an Habsburgic dominance over the entire country, with 30 years war, etc. In 1643, for example, Hermann Conreg published the work De Origine Juris Germanici, so the origin of the Germanic law, in which he stressed the importance of the autochthonous juridical tradition, demonstrating, by the way, that the legend according to which Germany would have known the Rezeption of Roman law since the first half of the 10th century, at the time of Emperor Lothar II, was completely unfounded. Right? It's also pretty obvious. I mean, the 10th century, they really were thinking very different things, and they wouldn't even need to receive Roman law at that point. This would be like Germany had so many issues naturally with this concept of Romanity because of the Holy Roman Imperial stand in general, and in fact the relation of these various states, even with the Habsburgs and their authority, their imperial plans at this point. So it's a much more complicated thing than I make it sound, but I don't plan to come back particularly strongly on these topics anytime soon, but if you're interested, we could go much more in depth, because there was also a great deal, as you understand here, of philological, historical research behind this juridical doctrine. It had necessarily been the case with Saint Roman law, as you understand. It had been about all the reconstruction of the original Justinian books, their comment what it meant at the time, what in the mind of the legislator, but what it meant in its application today. And by the way, Roman law was, as we were saying, very. I mean, in the Renaissance, thanks to the commentarist theory, extremely oriented towards problem solving. Right, so it was incredibly useful. Also, Europeans at this point were sharing basically each other's doctrines. Like the tribunals of all of Western Europe were basically reading each other's sentences and were saying, in Spain they did like this. Oh, okay, so in Germany they did like that. What do you think about this? Well, in England here we think this, and we are in France we think that. And this was really a big deal in terms of also the necessity of some statal homogenization. If you wonder even where the standards of Western Europe, of course they're not just legally founded, but really come from in general development. It does come from a radical intertwinement, even about the juridical issues. It was about state building. It was about finding the money for the armies and conquering the world, managing the colonies, etc. Like it's extremely important in insight. But it's also a very internally European thing as well, just in the relation with the other state, with the various continental states. Now, the Germanistic current influenced, of course, also the same German doctrine of common law, right? Because within it, a new original current of thought that was defined as the Usus modernus pancdectarum, from the title of the work of the jurist Samuel Strick, published in 1690, was to make a substantial difference. In fact, in the reading of the same Roman law, right? There was so much, like, think about during the Reformation, connected with the old way of doing things of the Catholic Church in general. Like, aside from the strictly theological issues, there was a greater, or even in function, there was a greater sense of like the system has not updated. The Church just says that it's like this, and basically even just the lay authorities do the same, but the world is changing somehow, and so we are criticizing that, we're protesting, and we must find some sort of alternative way, at least they're reading the same things, right? At least, as you know, this is not a Protestant channel, but you must understand historical phenomena, in fact, not just merely on a, say, you have to understand it in the whole dimension of the same, not just, okay, this is also about the Catholic challenge, the traditional challenge to, in fact, modern updating, right? What does it mean to be a traditional Catholic while the world is changing? Like, this is metaphysically just already something that a Christian already knows, but the question is, how do you adapt, right? One thing is the divine standard, but what about the earthly one? Like, these are important questions. That's why the world is changing in many ways, also ruinously to some degree, but in a way, in fact, that you must forcefully cope with if you have belief in works, of course, but not all. And convinced of the value of the Germanic juridical traditions, the jurists of the new current of the so-called usus modernus, in fact, the modern use of the pandected, whereas part of the Justinian Code, believed that the Romanization of the same Germanic juridical traditions, which was accepted, of course, because it could not be stopped. Like, Roman law was there to stay, right? Evidently enough, but it wouldn't have had to denaturate like the contents of the original Germanic jurisdiction. But it had to be, in fact, pursued only when this would have resulted useful, let alone possible, right? Meaning that, okay, we have these categories from a Roman law. do we need them, right? Is there some self-sufficiency, self-standing capacity of the Germanic juridical tradition that can make the local states work without having to, risking losing some part of its effectiveness because of the introduction of Roman law? In other words, the jus commune had to be intended as in force in the German regions by the admission of the same current, not in its entirety. Again, Roman law at this point could not really be done without, right? But only in those norms that were judged reconcilable with the traditional usages and that could be a safe, practical utility. This depended on many factors, depending in fact also on the different levels of development of the various areas. Germany was quite big and different within itself, right? So it's obvious that, say, the Catholic South was historically richer, and under the Habsburgs would accept Roman law in a sort of more sensible way than the northeast, right, of the Protestant, that we're still living in part of very feudal ways still, right? So especially this divide makes you understand why would there be a resistance to the homogenization proposed by Romanistics, right? And among the principal members of this new current of thought, we can remember Christian Thomasius. These names were there was a way in Europe. It actually was probably an office proposed and made in Rome, right, to Latinize all the names of the officials of the important people, etc., that would have had to figure in the official documents because the official language was Latin, right? So you find these, also the way that the name passed down to fame is sometimes a hybrid between these things. These were Latinizations, again, of some vernacular names. This guy was specifically, Christian Thomasius, one of the founders in 1694 of the University of Halle, right? Which is in fact in the northeast of Germany, and it's part of those areas that in fact will stand more for the new, that in many ways was actually the reactionary side of the story in a German perspective, right? The new address putting on the four the practical profiles of the Rezeption influenced from one side the didactic or system of the universities, on the other, of course, in parallel, the scientific study of law. For example, school reading of the Justinianian and canonistic texts was enriched by a more direct attention to the praxis of the tribunals, while in the general studia, new classes were added to the traditional ones, such as the ones, for example, processual law, feudal one. Also, this is very interesting in a historical philological sense of ancient Germanic law, right, and also of public law. I remember just some months ago, one of you asked me about the so-called Gothic constitution, which is not quite, but it part of this juridical thinking, but it's part of the theory of it and the history of it, and the way, of course, to a specific law, a specific social order would have had to be reflected. We have seen it recently, also in terms of military theory. Right, the idea that the Dutch at some point think themselves either as the Romans or as the Carthaginians that were fighting against the Romans because they saw themselves in terms of their tactical experiments as more advanced, like Hannibal, that would crush the legions that would be in the tercios that were terrorizing the Netherlands at that point. So there's a lot of this classicistic thing going on. So even for medievalistics, like the recovery, for example, the Germanic laws that we were incidentally discussing yesterday, and we made already multiple videos about, was also an important part of the reflection on the originary customs of the people, who are the Germans in this case. I don't know, these are the same years in which the Swedes and the Spanish are literally arguing with one another who was the actual descendant of the gods, right? Given, going back to the migration era, and of course the most radically, opposed Catholic and Protestant, side of also geographical sides of Europe for that matter. So this actually shows you even the scale by which this debate was relevant. It was not just limited to Germany, and whatever Germany expressed in this sense was also part, especially because of the 30 Years' War, of the general idea of the empire, of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. So it's really a lot of stuff that goes on, right? But mostly, less romantically, less poetically, what these Germans are doing specifically are saying, we should be using Roman law, but we should also consider that in our local practice we're using in certain areas, especially specific procedures, concepts, etc., that we must start integrating as well within Romanistics, because probably just out of sheer practice, they seem for our tribunals, for our society, to be working, and we must pursue that direction. So there is also in this a very pragmatic orientation, and indeed also a sort of intellectual stimulus and flourishing and of theory, etc. Consider what Europe is going under this time. There is a massive development all around, right, and within Germany. So this reflection is quite much needed, this revision as well. So doctrine was expressed especially in commentaries, right, which, as we've seen, were also proper of the Romanistic tradition. So a literary form that would examine the specific matters of the Justinian and canonistic texts, and that was particularly careful about, again, the practical side of the story, right? These works would come out as mostly monographic treatises, collections of consilia, so some greater advice, juridical takes, criticism, and other works of practical use. For example, some notaries' formularies, right? So again, down the line properly of everyday life sort of agreements among privates and so on. This would, as we were saying before, also expand in other interesting fields, for example, such as true and proper studies on the law of specific German cities or regions, and or the Germanic juridical traditions historically, right? So that we start understanding actually a lot through the same 17th century texts on some aspects of this. Again, Europe is really expressing, also Germany in many ways, but lots of different political, philosophical theories that are now revolving around properly the concept of the state, the monarchy, the republic. Again, these things had been going on from a while, especially from the Renaissance. Now every country was sort of now redefining a bit, reconfiguring its own specific national background in relation with these ideas. Among the names we can remember for at least the 17th century, this address, there is Benedikt Karpzov, Hermann Konring, Johannes Brunnenmann, David Mavius, Georg Adam Struve. Now, the attention for the local customary tradition marked not just Germany, but as we've seen, this other Germanic land that had seceded properly from the empire. We're talking about the United Provinces in the northwest, that in fact had just achieved, like in the mid 17th century, the formal recognition of their independence from the Spanish Habsburgic dominion, and as such also properly the one, in fact, from the Holy Roman Empire. In 1575, the University of Leiden had been founded. This was a very important step in the definition of the Dutch nation and sort of intelligentsia. This had been followed between the end of the 16th and the first half of the 17th century by other important studia, such as the one of Franeker, Groningen, Utrecht, Harderwijk. Now, specifically the teaching in Leiden by the French Hugues Donat, Latinized in Donellus, began in 1579, influenced the methodological frame of the juridical science that, albeit adhering to the Mos Italicus, derived from the Mos Gallicus the attention towards the philological analysis of the Roman texts, and for their historical evolution, the knowledge of which was researched, was sought after, also on the basis of non-juridical sources. This is just a broader legacy of the Renaissance. We have seen in the aforementioned video about the Dutch drill, all the intuitions the Nassaus had about the modern military through the inspiration to modern treatises from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. There was an enormous deal of philological hype. Right, let's say the Netherlands really qualify themselves as Western Europe compared to Germany as rather Central Europe, right? And they acquire a bit more like the highest levels of this juridically traditional address. They get the Italian one and the French one, right? This guy Hugues Donat is a French. We've seen how many actual Huguenots had fought and were present in the Netherlands, and they were all into this philological research, etc. So this space from the military to the juridical issues, and they were inspired again to the highest levels of Western tradition. As you know, the Netherlands had not been a particularly developed place historically up to the Renaissance, at least. But now we're literally taking off and becoming, in fact, as today, one of the single richest, most advanced nations in the world. So they were essentially updating them with this freshness, with this sort of modern idea, but also founding themselves on the cornerstones of tradition, for at least how they interpreted it. And in fact, at the same time, the United Provinces doctrine open to the current that had been followed in neighboring Germany, and again, the fact that it was a strong Protestant alliance between the northern German states and the Dutch was, of course, like making the latter signing also in this sort of more, okay, let's look at the Germanic side of the story, not just the say the reception of Romanistics per se, which for a young nation that has literally declared its own independence from the universal empire is just like a metaphysical deal, right? They have to find an answer for. The Dutch would receive, in particular, the German reflections on the let's say, the enforced nature of the sole Justinian norms that could be conciled specifically with the local tradition, donating the latter a precise theoretical frame. In other words, they were using the Roman categories as a system to adapt their same common law to the same type of category, like, with just different contents. So Usus Grotius, right, with the work Enlightenment tot the Hollandische Rechtsgeleerdheid, I think I read it with a bit of German license here. That would mean, by the way, the introduction to Dutch jurisprudence, proposed himself to define, in fact, the same categories of the Dutch law corresponding to the ones elaborated by the doctrine of common law, but in parallel, as we've seen with the Roman one. In fact, within this frame, Roman law was recognized by Grotius a ineliminable practical function, that one of contributing in virtue of its supreme authority to the coexistence of the peoples, right, and offering them, so the instruments, to read in an orderly law the pluralism of tradition and local praxis. It's a very wise approach, because Grotius is saying we do not. You see that this came during the debates, of course, also some sort of international law for even after 30 years of war to protect civilians, to have some sort of general peaceful coexistence, etc. So that these are still universal thinking, and they do want to achieve still a universal order, right? The empire, the papacy were deputed to that, but things had changed to the degree that of course, their power was limited. But you see, it's very traditional to think, okay, just like with common law, like every country has its own common law, but it is under like a sole rule, and as such, we have just to help. This is very traditional in thinking, like elevating the common laws of the various countries to that higher level of juridical interpretation that we have had for Roman law, that was thought, in fact, to be used to rule over multiple countries. And these now are also elevating themselves through the modeling after the Roman categories of their own law, and teaching it. And this is, again, incredibly important, because up to this point there had not really been a theory for most of these lands. In fact, common laws like these had existed, people would use them, but society had been simple enough up to that point to just have them, practiced, but not written in a systemic theory, right? And as such, you instead see now that with the development of a modern state, like the single countries gradually adapting the same common law. It was modified by some degree to fit the new reality as well. That's also why in Germany Roman law was so much used next to common law, because that's what they needed. It was available, it was already well ordered and functional in itself. So this is also what Grotius in practice is saying. And in fact, so first of all, exactly because only the norms and the categories of theory apt to frame and discipline the juridical relations that were taking place in practice required the use of Roman law, right? And this current that Grotius inaugurates would be very important for other 17th century authors, such as, among the others, Arnoldus Vinnius, Simon van Groenenwegen, van de Made, Ulrich Huber, Simon van Leuven. So between the end of the 17th and the first half, also the 18th century, the juridical science of the United Provinces that were literally booming at that point were essentially the most advanced country in Europe under many aspects, refined further its characteristic traits. And historians have defined the jurists of this period as the members of the so-called elegant Dutch school, right? And this is important because the latter was distinguished conceptually from the aforementioned Usus modernus pandectarum of the neighboring Germanic regions that in many ways were more backwards, right? And especially, in fact, in the areas where that address would prevail, because again, the Dutch are just taking this to a next level, a national one, a much richer, advanced society than, say, the Northern German one. And so, admittedly, they are really different from the same. They just have in common this mitigation of the Romanization of common law through like a much greater space given to the latter and the capacity to create through the same Romanistic categories a common law theory that could essentially parallel even Roman law in some important aspects, right? There is a debate, however, in terms of the essence of the difference between the Dutch elegant school and the Usus modernus pandectarum in Germany, right? There is not really a radical difference in the principle, right? The systems are very different because, yes, the Netherlands and Northern Germany are very different, but the essence of the thought and the interaction between Roman law and the common one is pretty similar. And yes, there are differences of between the various authors. You can't go as far as tracing a sort of a Dutch boundary there at some point, but right, they're also sometimes not even so like conceptually innovative, like what was started in the previous generations, right, fundamentally would remain there. To this Dutch, elegant Dutch school, we ascribe, among the others, names like Johannes Wirth, Gerard Noot, Alton Schulting, Cornelis van Eck, Cornelis van Bingerschek, etc. Now, still in this critical phase between the second half of the 17th and the first half of the 18th century, also the Germans were innovating some aspects of their the Usus modernus pandectarum. And this took a different direction, let's say a more traditional one, let's say the reevaluation of especially these older customs of the German regions, right? And there are lots of works that essentially listed the Justinian norms that had been abandoned by practice because they were surpassed by the concrete life of law, which was an indirect way to point out how, in fact, the same Roman law was not so like the old problem solver, right? And that, in fact, pointed out how some local customs were, of course, adapted to like a 17th and 18th century reality, right? it's difficult here. We stopped to Germany and the Netherlands, but like also in the rest of Europe, a lot of stuff is going on juridically, politically, and so in terms of state building, etc. So actually, especially Germany, is remaining a bit more isolated from this top thing, and it's sort of looking inwards, like within itself, to in fact starting to build proper some states on the basis of these say felt perceived, you can say fully national traditions, because also the German states were just loosely based on some, for example, the ethnic duchies, etc. These things had gone past, like in practice, since the Middle Ages, but there was again also a historical somehow like what the Sonderweg would sort of point out, like in the idea that Germany in fact was a bit different from the other countries in Europe, because it didn't derive its unity as it would this was an early time to think simply in those terms, but hey, like in the 19th century you already have nationalism exactly in this sort of federative way, for which still contemporary Germany is a federation of different states that are perceived as such. Also, say in an identitary sense within Germany, right? And this definitely produces like this a very different outcome from, say, what, for example, the Netherlands were doing or other countries were doing. We see works that pretty much like the Enlightenment of Grotius would insert norms of Germanic origin in the commentaries to the Libri Legalis, that were the ones of Roman law, right? And of the Romanistic science. And this is relevant because, again, it's just like this. Let's simply use all we have and integrate it for our local purposes. And this is a very interesting concept, because essentially Roman law had been discovered, recomposed by the Italian jurists exactly in the same way. They hadn't decided for some reason to just recover Roman law and to substitute it to their own common law, to the feudal laws, to the imperial constitutions. They were to mix it with their own sources, and originally when there was a gap, like filling it with the Roman law, that also in the way it was being recomposed appeared naturally ever more suitable for like the important development of the local economy and society, because it was booming. And in that way, like at least the Italian juridical science, the Mos Italicus, had presented the Libri Legalis to the rest of Europe that had acquired them eagerly because of the effectiveness of the same tradition. So it's fascinating that the Germans are doing something similar with their own law, right? In a time in history in which, evidently, since Germany was was a particularly fragmented country juridically speaking, and on the basis of the judicial authorities that operated within it, of course the local custom was sort of more relevant than one that could simply be adapted for the whole country, and again that varied importantly within the same. So this depends. In fact, there are countries in Europe that even if they are when they are politically divided to some extent, are more homogeneous in terms of juridical culture. This is the particularity of Germany in many ways. And we see of this mix a result in the Thesaurus Practicus of Christoph Bezold, the Jurisprudentia Forensis Romano-Germanica by Georg Adam Struve, and the commentary on the Institutiones by Joachim Hoppe. So you understand how even so deeply soaked into practice, into also the same Roman doctrine, and both theoretical and in fact quite practical issues that this sort of this doctrine was looking at. Furthermore, the interest for the local juridical tradition was not the monopoly of juridical science in Germany and in the United Provinces. We observed it, for example, talking about the Iberian Peninsula, that had an important juridical production during the Middle Ages, and in which actually, like the same monarchies had tried to suppress in a way, especially imitating the Italian, the Mos Italicus, that in this sense was so Roman to certify, just like mostly the controlled origin of the saint that could be used by the crown as well, even though the crowns actually of Spain, because Spain was technically never unified until the 18th century. It was just a dynastic union. Legal codes and traditions could not be eliminated, so there was an interest, as we've seen, in fact, in Iberian Peninsula, in their own, say, medieval constitutions, etc. So that's a very variegated sort of. Excuse me, I'm admittedly distracted by better things, but I'm bear with me. I will simply finish this. Now, what aspects can we observe? Well, what we just said, for example, belonged a bit to the same Neapolitan kingdom that had a quite. We didn't talk so much about southern Italy in this channel. Like I think we should make much more. And southern Italy had actually a quite composite juridical tradition as well. There were still, by the 19th century, some Lombard laws that had been issued back in the day. They were essentially enforced. But this is also the beauty of the Ancien Regime, broadly meant to mean the existence of this still, the idea that you can't go back and look at what even a medieval norm that maybe somebody had forgotten could still mean in practical law, and how to resort to that, given the hierarchy of relevance of the same for all the reasons that could come about. Extremely complicated history. Like, just to be a lawyer in this context meant to have an insane mind, right? Of course, practice would be simplified, but if you really want to dig into the history and the theory, you could find everything. In fact, as you know, in European history, there are plenty at this point, these centuries of these figures of the lawyers that are mocked, characteristic, surrounded by books, like full with dust, like looking at all this sort of most abstruse, say, possible laws, postulae things, everything that could be used in a juridical context. By the way, again, in Latin, so even in the older vernacular languages, a pretty messed up situation. But to make the long story short, in the Neapolitan kingdom, you find the same interest for the local juridical tradition. Between 1605 and 1643, Carlo Tapia published the work in 7 volumes named Jus Regni Neapolitani, so the law of the Neapolitan kingdom, a law in which the sources were collected and listed as, for example, constitutions, chapters, rituals, the pragmatics, privileges, right? And then the commentarists, like all the theory of the commentarists on this melange, this congerie of laws, constitutions, chapters. So the heterogeneity, the mass made law, right? Another Neapolitan author, Scipione Rovito, wrote some commentaries to the same legislation, Prospero Rendella studied the Longobards tradition that we mentioned before, and Giacomo Antonio Marta dedicated important research also to the concrete life of law. So you see all the facets, all the various branches, the object of interest of, again, scholars, people, of lawyers, of people that were not just judges, lawyers, whatever, but they had some greater interest, like the 18th century, you see witnesses, in fact, also the juridical Enlightenment. I made a video about that already. These are the same countries, in fact, which very important juridical traditions were really evolving in a sort of more, also rationalizing, not necessarily rational or rationalistic, right? But a direction, like acknowledging, for example, that there had been this past. Well, this was something that historiographically would just appear at this point, like the researches on medieval law, for example. Like, who would do this? The jurists with the instruments of the time. There wasn't even a proper historiography at the time, in the modern scientific sense. So the way these authorities would resort even to that past is incredibly fascinating. You see, there was a principle in the law of the French Revolution that was the judge becoming the bouche de la loi. So in other words, the idea that the judge had no other purpose than speaking whatever the statal code by that time with the civil law became truly absolute. In fact, the content of this of that jurisprudence. And so no interpretative, let's say, no personal inclination, not being biased, of course, that is an important juridical principle. But this is in fact the difference with the Ancien Regime, that in the Ancien Regime, the jurists, the judges, were powerful people. They were people with titles, with privileges, with a position, right? We have seen how in the Middle Ages, actually, being a doctor in law brought knighthood with it, right? So it was incredibly important, incredibly precious to have experts of law. But in many ways, this could be creative, could be resorting again to this previously unknown sources, or at the moment, like sort of our old and apparently inactable, or at least too archaic, too outdated sources that, however, were technically low and that were seen, say, in the way they could be, reused. It could be applied again through a principle of reasoning on conviction that, in fact, the judge could more or less accept without having even to justify it more than much. Thus, all in all, framed within the theoretical and unitary categories of the canon Roman law, the, say, particular law, that's another way of saying, like, the customary one, but whether as a sum of all the various specificities of a certain community's juridical tradition, would end up to characterize in a specific way the contents of the jus commune, which is in fact to be observed in each institutional reality. So every people, as we were pointing out before, was living in a different way the experience of their own common law. During the 17th, the 18th century, this awareness, as we've seen, also historically increased. This is also, again, that peoples are going towards more like nationalism. There's a crisis of universal values, or at least that they have to. They're starting being replaced with from one side some rationalistic coldness, whereas there is another part that is emphasizing just like the people's, characterization in some ways. Naturally, at a serious, at a high level, aside from philosophy, like juridically, we find specific, in fact, terminologies based on the various nations or the outcome of a specific historical identity. For example, in Germany, like the local doctrine spoke of a Jus Romano-Germanicum. For example, Georg Adam Struve entitled his work of 1670 Jurisprudentia Romano-Germanica Forensis. Right? So the jurisprudence, Romano-Germanic tribunal jurisprudence, essentially. The Spanish one, the Jus Romano-Hispanicum. Right? It's a bit like what we've seen before, like the Mos Italicus, the Mos Gallicus. Those had come earlier, right? To just be much more Roman to a degree, so they wouldn't need to. Like they got the national exception in a classicistic sense of Italy, France, etc. Speaking of Spain, by the way, it's Johannes Sala that published in 1788-89, fairly late, as you understand, the Institutiones Romano-Hispaniae, in 2 volumes. The Neapolitan tradition was called the Jus Romano-Neapolitanum. In 1780, Giuseppe Basta printed the Institutiones Juris Romani Neapolitani. The United Provinces spoke of, at least they didn't characterize it to like these previous nations, but they spoke of a Frisian Roman Frisian law, right? At least this is what Ulrich Huber and Simon van Leuven spoke in their Dutch treaty. Say their treaty of Romano-Dutch law, right? So it was not understood properly as as fully as for the other nations. Consider that the Netherlands were also smaller to a degree, so they had less problem of qualifying themselves internally, like compared to countries of important, say, complex articulated tradition like Naples, Spain, especially. So you have, for all these denominations, the birth of the jus odiernum, right? So today's law, a sort of mixture between Roman law and the local national one. In fact, we see in these works Roman law meeting with its universal authority, universal and superior authority of common law, because that's how Roman law had been exported like, right? It had been substituted effectively with common law because it was essentially like, this is the universal one we need in the empire, right? It works well. The most developed places need this and maintain it. But other traditions that also keep developing later on, while recognizing still, like Grotius, this, so it's not a matter of opinion really, this was a superior as universal authority, flanked to it or even attached to it certain parts of the common law of the single regions that, by the way, was a very complex thing. We don't have to think about the common law as the law of the people, strictly meant. These were incredibly stratified hierarchical systems. We're talking about royal laws, the jurisprudence, as we've seen, issued by the judges, and of course also the local uses as like the communities. We don't have to think. Just like the little village that had its own law and nobody would touch. Like this process of homogenization law had been happening. Exactly at this point had been happening to uniform the common law of these entire countries that, let's remember it, by being ancien regime, had ideally this plurality of different laws depending on the local customs, but not of the single country, many different pieces of the single country. This is not even just to talk about Germany. This is to talk about the single states, for example, of Germany, that do not have this originally, right? Or at least had been working in order to homogenize it in the same way. And so this is a very strong blending, right, for carrying out territorial unity. Also, the idea of common law, like the adjective, is referred to the law used by a superior authority, but also the one of a general law that thus could constitute the foundation of this extended community now. There was in all this, like, again, these are incredibly complex topics and complicated ones, because again, here I'm making it simple for didactic reasons, but think about the royal laws and how these, we've seen it well in Spain, how, say, there had been a contrast between, again, the laws of the single communities, of the single kingdoms, and one of the kings that eventually came to rule over them, even as a dynastic sum by now in the early modern age. So it's a huge deal, all right? It's an issue which had been, again, the same one again. I homogenized this law on the basis of what? Right? Yes, the communities have to agree, but how do I actually enforce it? As a military historian, actually, you would be surprised to hear that the thing that is more striking, that the homogenization of this process passed through the establishment of the armies, because the armies previously were billeted in various areas of the kingdom, and now these areas, instead of, let's say, suffering this, prefer to pay some law to the central authority, and as such, thus giving way to this in order to have something in exchange, being co-opted in the state, for example, the local nobility, in the way this apparatus would work, and thus through this co-optation, homogenizing also the administrative procedures for the same, like tax collections, the troops recruitment, and so on. Right, so it's not just like an abstract dynamic or something happening for no reason. Alright, it would be deeper philosophical reasons for this, but let's say we do not discuss them specifically now. So in all these regions, the common law that we met was essentially associated with the local usages according to the reading of juridical science that was not seeing itself as the jus commune, a Roman or merely like local, but essentially the fusion of the same as the same jus commune at this point, but of the entire territory, or the general right of the territory. So a nationalization, in other words, of the law. And in German, of course, nationalization is a big deal, but let's call it better general law of the territory, because it could be applied in different ways, even just as a jurisprudential fashion, not because, in fact, these territories were ruled by the same authorities that could issue that uniformly. This is particularly important. I mean, Germany wouldn't be unified until pretty late compared to this. But it's in Germany, finally, that this current had a further expression at the beginning of the 18th century, when the doctrine sort of focused its attention on the sole law of the German regions. And this passage was illustrated clearly for the first time by Georg Bayer, that was was a professor at the University of Wittenberg, of disciplines that at that point were excluded by the teaching because they had not been touched by the Roman law. He inserted this new material in his lectiones, in the classes, and eventually he found his first, this matter, this new subject found its first definition scientifically in the work of Johann Gottlieb Einetschus, the Elementa Juris Germanici, in 2 volumes appeared in 1735 and 37 respectively, offering was a systematic exposition of the pure elements of German law that were in force across all Germany. So there was a hierarchy. It's interesting because the German constitution still today works as that. There is a common law at the center, actually above all the laws of the states, to different degrees. But it's very reminiscent of, conceptually at least, of how the Germans were seeing now at the time. I mean, like the possibility of homogenizing something German-wide, right? Again, this is definitely a path to the nationalization, the unification in many ways. And this again had been the case for, as we've seen, many other countries. Also, Italy was politically divided, but fundamentally they used the Mos Italicus very homogeneously, and this had happened before just because these places were sort of more advanced. France as well had done the same, even if it was a country that had been expanding and sort of, over other countries in a sense, at least chewing part of them, and in having, think about the difference between the north and the south, like literally in the pays de loi écrit and the pays de droit écrit et de droit coutumier. So, like, those were a big deal in Spain too. That, as we just said, actually Castile and Aragon were not really unified statally, thus juridically, until the 18th century. Right, aside from the dynastic union since the 15th. So it's like Germany is the most interesting in this process of nationalization because it's gradual. You can follow it on the basis of a juridical science that sort of thinks all that also in the relation of the other countries and says, okay, how do we do it given that we are all fragmented in a way that can't be solved politically, because literally the biggest countries, German countries, are outside Germany. Like the Austria and Prussia are fundamentally, but most of their territories beyond is in Hungary, in Poland, right? And Germany had remained that sort of puzzle of so many different states that, albeit at this point sort of gaining more specific mass, and are far from that capacity of even thinking to exercise a common law for everybody. And in fact, not even today this technically happens. Right? At least it happens only at a level. And by the way, the development of the juridical science between the 17th and the 18th century doesn't stop here. There are so many things going on. Think about just naturalism. I mean, European culture at this point is all about this. And it does recuperate. People think in the 18th century, I don't know, what was invented. These were all universal principles in the Catholic tradition, had always existed, ever, right? There are some, that there is at least at this point the hypostatization of an idea that of a right, of an innate right within man, which essentially parallels the spark of divinity that tradition had always stated, and that thus would constitute an essential part of their nature. It's essentially the same reason why in common law, so in all the countries in the world, like people were thought to have the right, because they had the power of imposing that. It's, again, that's how kings receive. They're not absolute kings ruling. In the 18th century are very limited actually in their power, and it's always the people that confers them like this green light, okay, you can legislate in that direction, because it's always the decisive moral majority that does that. You can have a greater spark or smaller spark. In the 18th century, the idea is that we should essentially increase the power of the individual by counting them all equally, which is a said another concept which is emerging from the confusion of the difference, in fact, between power and action in terms of, potential and action in terms of the individual, in fact, potential in action, like in fact that we are all given today, like the Western world, equal rights, is just like a great undeserved gift for the majority of people that of course are not going, like they're of course being the right to do certain things only, so it's not a huge deal, but the fact that we are given individually all this and we are judged all in an equal way is in theory like the measure by which we should be counted equal. At least the principle in itself wouldn't be empirically wrong to order the state, and in fact we live as well as we never did historically, but it shouldn't be confused with the idea that in action we're actually equal, right? That's the same reason why, for example, I don't know, if you're a minor you can't drive a car, for example, so you can't say that's a limitation of what, who decides that. It's always the idea of human rights, etc. They are a convention that is used essentially to train mankind to think they have this potential, because in the past, in some broken, spent systems, people were not even told to have a potential, so they were kept down because of their own fault, always, metaphysically, but still they had not been helped by those who could elevate them and ignite once again that potential to become act. I talked this in other videos. This is not so important, but it's incredibly important, but at least today we do not have the full time for this. In essence, however, at the time, these inalienable rights were to, let's say, had to be, of course, put into norms, and as such confronted for an adequate integration within the same juridical system. Of course, again, I can't digress on the broader philosophical, cultural, political implications, but as you know, in the 18th century, this thing was rampant, right, as an idea. And needless to say as well, particularly sensitive to these principles was the French doctrine, that because France had the greatest imbalances as far as the rights distribution, and especially for the balance of such an enormously also powerful system, and the extension of these rights to at least a considerable part of the people, because not even the French Revolution would give, like, it would be all a progression, like before universal suffragium, as you know. And so the French, however, that historically had managed this larger and, say, anciently unitary state, right, as a single one, and truly through civil law, a quite strong monarchy, imperial ambitions, etc., pushed for this new, the inspiration, at least for a new research of a unitary and systematic reading of the Justinian law, as the Mos Gallicus had already acquired, right? So particularly important in these, again, I made a video about the 18th century, so I'm not going to discuss what happened later, but already in the 17th, and this is very important also for the history of philosophy, everything that had been formulated in the 17th century, say, everything that sort of the 18th century became famous for, had been already relayed from antiquity during the 17th century. Right, if you study Montaigne, if you, like, everything it could seem like, oh, that's typically, Enlightenment. Actually, in the 17th century was already there. It had been produced in an ever more, archaic reality that already knew, of course, those principles from tradition. In any case, from a juridical point of view, the most important work is the 17th century one of, for the 17th centuries of Jean Thomas, with the treaty Les lois civiles dans leur ordre naturel. Right, so the civil laws in their natural order, right, which is sort of makes a lot of sense. There is an earthly and a divine dimension, right? So one material and a spiritual one, if you want. And there is of course an important divide between the two things, but of course this was the effort, it was the purpose of justice in the first place, which is the ultimate deal of, at least in an earthly sense, to say proposing to the construction of a systemic order in which unifying the plurality of the juridical norms, an order founded on the principles of natural law, from which the theoretical categories had to descend, right? And then so that you could insert the norms into them. Very interesting. So this is mostly the work of a jurist, of course, but there are some other implications, such as the idea that the purpose of justice is coming closer to God's love towards everyone, and so giving everyone equality of opportunity. Again, that is extremely different from equality of outcome, right? So at the end of the day, full justice can never be achieved, and you have to draw the line somewhere so that, yes, if you're in difficulty, I will help you, and that will be granted to you as a, say, even universal right, but there is a limit to that because I can give you everything, right? And that's basically what politics is. So there was an important purpose wanted by Dumas in general, which is also one of putting things together orderly. All right, we've seen that the ancient regime had a massive heterogeneous juridical tradition. And so the 18th century is also this desperate effort of uniformity, like of order, of reason, like something that can fit categories for everybody, like as a pre-packed system. This is the Enlightenment, essentially, even way before the thirst of knowledge. I mean, medieval people were much more thirsty of knowledge than people in the 18th century, who instead were very, very, very much concerned about the sort of encyclopedically obsessive need to classify everything that we sort of inherited, at least in a scholastic fashion. So the technical instrument of law is the continuous research of the esprit, in Dumas' words, of unity that would tie among each other all the elements of right. I mean, if you have to make justice for the universe, you have to understand how this works all together. It can't be just single pieces of an unjoined organism. All right, and Dumas was also insisting on private law as well, because at least it's complex to digress on this, but let's say that the way, of course, in which these individual rights were connected with the statal authority is a huge deal, because the statal authority has to protect you, has to guarantee your own, the enactment of your decision. Like it just has to provide with a security that should be enough for you to be able to, for the law to be able to be respected. So it's a big deal. The Roman law in this were subsumed within this unity, this wall, founded on a sort of meta-positive law in itself. It was essentially witnessing the reinforcement of essentially of ratio scripta, right? The fact that there had to be a certainty of the law and its enactment, but also probably the accessibility, the fact that everybody could access it in a way or another, all right? And so the judges, as we were saying before, could not use discretion to, this is paving the path to civil law, right? Which is Roman law technically, but we have distinguished it from common law in ways that are cultural rather than historical, right? Because as we discussed today, I'm very surprised to know that civil law was actually meant to be common law, right? And I mean, we'll talk more about the French Revolution and how in civil law countries, in fact, the state became the single source of law, right? This is in fact the French outcome in this, and it's something that was boiling in the pot from quite a while, because again France was quite unbalanced in many ways, and also the jurists had realized that things had to be brought to a higher level to surpass the impasse, if you want, and allow the wordplay. So what was the principle behind it? Of course, elevated rationale, equity, right? So equity, as you know, is a very important aspect of common law, and so you can't think it wouldn't exist in civil law, but it just, in fact, equity in common law means something specific, also procedural, other than merely theoretical, in accepting, in fact, actually the arbitrium of the judge for certain particular cases, right? And not sticking. So let's see how also common law is actually a hybrid. Aside from the fact that much of it is also based on jurisprudence, but so civil law actually is to an important degree. I mean, it's obvious that you can have that law, but the way you interpret it for certain cases depends on how society changes. And law is always interpreted at the end of the day. And there was, in fact, this attempt of expanding the reading of the ratio scripta, the law, in terms of wide, abstract categories. All right, because these could arrive to contain the entirety of the otherwise confused and contradictory plurality of praxis. Naturally, this entails the French Revolution, the creation of an absolute state, of an unprecedented central power, etc., to arrive to discipline it. But so it happens eventually with the Code of Napoleon. It would take a while. We are still in the 17th century. By the way, it was ever more the institutiones and ever less the digestum to constitute the central part of the Justinianian collection for the 17th century jurists. Why? Because the institutiones were the foundational branch, and they provided with those categories that we're talking about. The digestum was rather instead an interpretation of specific cases, of specific, like it was the building of a theory that in this sense was the product of the past in a way that could not be understood anymore in the day. What is interesting about Germany, coming back to it, is that its doctrine opened to, of course, to the influence of the naturalistic doctrines, but in particular those currents that were already sensible to the instances of the humanistic agorist turned to the natural law to search for general principles from which to move in the construction of a unitary juridical order, and to enlighten in the interpretation of the texts. And aside from the practical, also procedural, like side of the story, it's obvious that the Renaissance would be connected with this just naturalistic principles. So again, don't think it was a product of the 18th century. The concept of equality, the concept of citizenry, all right, these were all things that were being dug, even just in the, as we've seen for the military dimension. How do you create an army of hoplites, let's say, if you don't have a police, right? And it's, of course, this is not to make comparisons. They tried to make comparisons, but they failed, because again, every society has a different way of doing historically. But of course, there were some patterns, certain tendencies that, like in the case of the extension, for example, of civic rights, was sort of, maybe at this point it was like a bit early for the 17th century, but in general, like the idea that, for example, on which basis do you rebuild a juridical theory if not from God? And in that sense, how do you, well, God is extreme, but if you have, say, you're a Protestant state after the 30 Years' War, and you have refused essentially at least great part of the papal and imperial interference in your political affairs. Which are the new foundations? Right, you have to search them into, in fact, philosophy, into what unavoidably is a more secular culture, and you must find at least you have to look at the historical example. As you know, the French Revolution was obsessed with Rome, even though it had barely anything to do with that. But that's how, in many ways, we have thought Rome from the 18th century onwards. So we're also being joked upon by these hallucinations in a way or another. To say, essentially, that there's a long wave of Renaissance and traditional recovery that we just don't recognize because at the time we were starting to forget tradition already, to the important degree that we wouldn't even know what tradition is today, and we think that this is just okay. These are the guys from the 17th, 18th century. They had those kind of ideas because for some strange reason, maybe it was technology, right? They were thinking now that extended rights were a good idea. Most people reason like this. They have no clue why this was happening. If we were to mention important authors of this, say, just naturalistic bias in the German doctrine, we can look at Samuel Strick, Justus Henning Böhmer, Augustin Leiser, and so when we look also at the Netherlands in parallel, first of all, just naturalism, it's Grotius, right? So he remains the center of them all. But after him, like the Dutch scholars in this field kept drawing just naturalistic insights towards the spotting of rational principles on which founding the reading of the juridical norms, right? So, yeah, I mean, as you know, I have actually completed my series about medieval law, right? So now we're looking just at the appendix of it, like like we saw this stuff also at some early time, right? But these are just like the very last episodes. I will perhaps just because we could do so much. We will. This is not the end of history of law in general, but let's say in a manualistic sense, we can consider the main insights founded. I rarely say this for any branch of the cycle because it's difficult to exhaust certain topics, but history of law I began back in the day when one guy asked me, "Oh, can you talk about medieval law, especially about pillaring?" And I was all like, because I studied medieval law at university. I mean, it was just one exam, nothing special. But it made a great impression on me. It was a particularly useful exam, even though it was fairly difficult and not so, let's say, pleasant to prepare. But I learned so many things, and interestingly enough, there were people from the faculty of law teaching it, like not close to my humanistic one. And it was very interesting on so many levels. I think I've explained here and there. I haven't created a playlist proper, but I think you can find some of the material. And understanding politics and society of the time through this is so enriching. People normally don't care about it, so I will. at best, I think that since there are some re-uploads, and many of these have to do with medieval law, so at some point I may re-upload them when I go on vacations. I need some fresh, let's say, work to re-upload, to provide just with some, excuse me, I'm distracted again, but I am entertaining some important relations right now. And to make the long story short, this is part of the end of our story. It's at least something that we will be pondering, and I probably create some sort of playlist descriptions, whatever. We must increase really this channel pace. We must do something that lasts longer, and there's so much stuff to do. I think we can approach this gradually. Still thinking how to reboot, you know. Last autumn, last winter were terrible, unfortunately. Part of them, most of them, for me, but I'm back on track so far. Everything goes well. Say the problem was solved, but really unexpected reasons, telling the truth. But now we have to increase the pace, and I don't know, it's more than 1 month that we came back to normal, and I've made pretty good videos so far, gotten lots of views, but we still have to do a lot more than that. I really had to work hard. We can't just stop here. We just can't be we, of course, we don't give up, but we also need to increase. We need to do something that is more than what we see now, right? Everything is on me, of course, but in a neutral sense, you make it happen as well. So if we work hard, we can go pretty far, right? We have just to believe firmly in all this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.